All right, thank you so much for coming. I can't tell you what joy it brings to my heart and my soul to have all of you here. When I interviewed for my job back last spring, one of the things I said I wanted to do if I had the privilege of becoming dean of this college was to reimagine business education. Because we have been in an era of profit-taking at the expense of lots of negative externalities. And what I would like us to be teaching as a college is value creation, value for all stakeholders. Absolutely, business needs to make a profit. It can't stay in business if you don't. But attending to the needs of all stakeholders and attending to the needs of our communities and utilizing system resources more efficiently and more effectively. So I have designated 3 Brian Dean speakers for this year. The first one came in November, and that was Karen Beck Dudley. She had just stepped down from her position as CEO of AACSB, which is our accrediting body. And she came and spoke to us about the importance to our accrediting body now of creating societal impact, positive societal impact as colleges of business. And what did that mean and what can we be doing? So we have been doing a lot of things. We have put the beneficence principles up on the wall for you to see on a daily basis as you walk in this building the importance of gratitude, the importance of integrity, the importance of these Ball State values that we have. The Ball State values are up. So you're seeing in the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, you've seen those on a wall. And so we are really trying to create this broader context of learning how to do business without doing harm. And so it's with that we also come to today's speaker, our second in the series, of Jens Molbak, and he has incredible stories to tell you about what is tri-sector innovation, and how does that march us down the road of businesses creating value, not just profit-taking, okay? So I'm gonna let him tell his own story. And then we have one more speaker in the series, and he is coming on March 20th, Stuart Hart. He will have a new book out. He's somebody who has 50,000 Google citations and a number of books, and he's just a real leader. He was part of publishing a book in the 90s on the fortune at the base of the economic pyramid and looking internationally at what are our markets and how do we view that. And so he will be talking about reimagining capitalism and what we do, because capitalism is the foundation of our economic system. And what more can we do to do good with capitalism? So with this, I'm really excited to have you all here. Thank you to your professors for making this a priority for you. Thank you for coming. Thank you to all of the faculty and the staff and the guests that we have here, community guests. This is just a marvelous time. So with this, I will introduce to you briefly, because Jens will tell his story. Jens Molbak, who is, like so many of you, a first-generation college student. He got his undergrad at Yale. He got his MBA at Stanford. So he comes with a really nice pedigree. He will tell you about the company that he had envisioned as a master's student that he took to I don't know, he just made a whole lot of money off this company before he sold it, okay? Millions and millions of dollars. I'll let him tell you about that. And he's very active. He lives in Seattle. He is very, very active in a variety of corporate things as well as community-based things. So he is an owner of Molbak's nursery, which I haven't really heard much about. He's a board member for the University of Washington Evans School of Public Policy, partner for Social Venture Partners Seattle, member of the Young Presidents Organization, and network member of the Ashoka Support Network. He's an avid biker, skier, you know, all of these wonderful things that you can do out in nature, and an enthusiast of landscape architecture. Jens is somebody I met back in 2017 at a conference. He presented at a conference, and I was so impressed with him that I invited him to be keynote speaker in 2019 when we had our North America Principles for Responsible Management Education conference. And he came to Cleveland and was our keynote speaker. And then I brought him to my prior university, Kent State University. That was during the pandemic, so it was virtual. He helped co-teach a course there with my husband. So we've got a history. And it's just my total delight to bring him here and have him address you.
Thanks, Kathy. Nice to see everybody. Before I launch in, can we get a quick kind of show of hands of like who's in the room? I'm not going to do everybody, but how many undergrad business students are here? Okay, like 2/3-ish. How about undergrads from other parts of Ball State? Okay, just shout out the other schools just out of curiosity real quick.
Yeah. Landscape architecture.
Landscape architecture, okay. Anybody else? Okay. How about faculty from the business school? Awesome, good faculty represent. And how about faculty from other parts of the university? Okay, awesome. What schools?
Landscape architecture.
Landscape architecture, all right. Well, we can talk about that. It's not what the talk's about, but we can get into it. How about community members, just in general? Great, several. Welcome. All right. So as you heard from Kathy, I'm Jens. I run a nonprofit organization called New Impact, which we're going to talk about a lot today. And I am really passionate about this idea of tri-sector innovation. And what my goal is today is to introduce you to this innovation and impact mindset. This is a different way of thinking about problems at scale and solving problems at scale. And my hope is that it'll be useful to each of you in your current studies, but also to you in your either current careers or your future careers, because my guess is that all of you have a sense of change that you'd like to see radiate out in the world. So we're going to be talking about this thing. My story starts in Denmark. My parents were born in 1925. I love Denmark. Most of my relatives are there. It's known as one of the happiest countries in the world. And when you look at societal progress metrics, it ranks really highly up there. All the Nordics do really well in terms of food security and housing and education and things. But that wasn't always the case. In 1939, or 1940, on April 9th, the Nazis invaded Denmark. So my parents were teenagers. Their schools were shut down. They met each other, actually, because both their schools were closed and they were forced to go to a different school. And it was a very tough time for them. They grew up in the Depression under German occupation, and they learned frugality, and they learned to be very resourceful with the resources that they had. When the war ended, Dad was an exchange student in 1948, and he came to the U.S. The U.S. was the beacon of freedom in the world, and he was really excited to get out of war-torn Europe. And he came to the U.S. because it represented democracy and freedom, the things that he hadn't had. He was also really interested in what he called the free enterprise system, or capitalism. And he was also disinterested in sort of American community-mindedness, right? Because Nordics have a deep sense of egalitarianism. So he came to the U.S. and he liked it. He liked it so much that he went back and married Mom in 1950, and they came together. And they stayed for 5 years. They had what they call an extended honeymoon. And thankfully for me, They liked it so much they decided to stay, and in 1957 they became citizens of the US. And it was a very extensive citizenship test. I have the whole book and the stories and that type of stuff. And I'm very proud that Mom actually gave the keynote at the naturalization ceremony in 1957. And this headline today does crack me up: Danish housewife will be honored. That was 1957, and that was Mom out there. So I grew up in this. I'm born and raised in the States, but I'm raised with this sort of Danish mindset and this sort of interesting combination between the two. And having Danish parents meant that I grew up with Legos. So our house was filled with Legos, or Legos, depending how you pronounce it. And there were tons of them around the house. We had bins and bins. And these weren't the Lego sets of today, which is paint by numbers. These were freeform Legos. You could pick out different blocks and put things together. And you could build all sorts of things, kind of only limited by your creativity and imagination. You could have a lot of fun with this. And I think about these Legos as a representation of how we might think about the resources in the world and how we might be able to use an analogy of Legos for solving problems that we want to see solved. So I use the Lego analogy because if you think about each Lego block as a resource in the world's resources are divided up into three sectors. There's a bucket called private sector companies who have built a lot of cool stuff in the world. There's another bucket, which is much smaller, called social sector or nonprofit organizations. They've built a lot of stuff, cool stuff in the world. And there's a third bucket of governments: cities, counties, states, federal agencies, right? So let's just think about the world's resources as living in these three buckets. And there's a ton of resources out there. Think about everything we've ever built, right? Every truck, every train, every building, every database, every set of connections, every ecosystem. Those are all resources that we have built in the world. And if you think about adding up the value of all those resources, not the money in the world, but the resources that have been built, it's about $500 trillion. The world is awash in amazing resources, and we have this huge store and this huge balance sheet of opportunity. So that's the big picture of resources and Lego bricks in the world. I want to go really micro and tell you about the resources I experience today. So I called this my Tri-Sector Day. So I woke up this morning in the Ball State Hotel. Thank you very much for the bed last night. And that bed, by the way, that I woke up in was built by a private sector company. I'm pretty sure that a public institution didn't build my bed. So that was a company who built my bed. I then made it as far as the bathroom, and I took a shower with public sector water. So thank you to the water utility, and is it the Muncie Water? What's the name of the utility here? Indiana, but thank you very much for that public sector water. I then had a cup of coffee, and I'm pretty sure the coffee had been certified fair trade by an NGO. So I hadn't even left my hotel room when I was having, a Tri-Sector Day. In fact, if you think about the coffee cup itself was built by the private sector, the water came from the public sector, and the coffee was certified by an NGO. So my coffee cup was actually a Tri-Sector coffee cup. My day continued. I had a lovely drive to lunch, thank you very much, on public sector built roads, and I'm using the internet now and GPS systems, all of which have been created by government. So the point is that all of us experience resources from all three sectors every day. We live in a tri-sector world, and it's just a matter of using the glasses that you have to see this vast amount of resources. So I just encourage you, as you walk around campus, think about, let's look at the room, like the lights, that came from the public sector, right? Can we think of a social sector entity in this room? Any nonprofits in the room? We have an actual person nonprofit. I'm guessing that Ball State is somewhat of a social sector organization and mainly funded, I don't know, are you social sector or public sector? 100% state?
No.
Less than 50% funding from the state? Yeah, so you're social sector with a little bit of public mixed in. And we obviously have private sector resources. So when we think about tri-sector innovation, what would happen if we could use these resources? What would happen if we could reach into the bucket of resources here? I'm just going to pull out a distribution system from a company, and I'm going to pull out a set of trusted relationships here from the social sector, and I'm going to pull out a set of government databases. I'm just naming these things, and I'm going to put them together in interesting ways. So we're going to talk about a lot of stuff today, but essentially all we're doing is looking at existing resources and assembling it. And this is the heart of a tri-sector business model. Make sense? Okay. So the mindset that I want to communicate today is think about these existing resources across the sectors, repurposing and aligning them, building those resources and those models with people at the center so we can actually build results that we want to have in society, and then create strategies we can actually use these resources and scale. This is what I call the tri-sector mindset. This is the main event. So when I think about you, you guys might be working alone on an idea. You might be working with a group and trying to think about what change you want to see happen in the world. What I'd like to suggest to you is that if you're working for a company in the future, whether that's a startup or a big company, you can use tri-sector innovation to make the company be stronger and thrive. If you currently work for a nonprofit organization or you end up working for one, you can use TSI to be more effective in scale. And if you end up working for a government entity, you can use TSI to be more efficient. It's really quite powerful. So each of you is working on something, and as much as I care about what you're working on, I really want to talk to you today about the how. And TSI is not about a specific outcome, and it's about an approach or a methodology. For those of you familiar with design thinking or human-centered design or agile, we're kind of in that same bucket. Okay, a couple of examples, a couple of case studies. So this is Coinstar, which is the company that I founded. Anybody here ever use a Coinstar machine? I always like asking this question now. When I asked this question in business school, they're like, what are you talking about and why would anyone ever use this? So it's great fun. So I was in business school and I took entrepreneurship classes. So I've been sitting in your shoes or your classes, and I thought a lot about, maybe it would be fun to start a company. I didn't plan to start a company. But I was curious, and I had some great entrepreneurship classes that encouraged that curiosity. So I'd moved a lot, and every time I moved, I had this ever-increasing jar of coins on my dresser top. Some of you may have had this phenomena happen. And so I ended up writing to the Fed and the Mint, and I asked how many coins had been produced. And what I learned is the US Mint had produced about $15 billion worth of physical coin stock to supply the US economy. Every time we do a cash transaction, you have the coins going back and forth. So I thought, well, that's a lot of coins. So I stacked my classes on 2 days a week, and I hung outside of Bay Area supermarkets, and I said, hi, I'm a grad student. I'm doing research on your coin jar. How much do you have? And what I learned is out of that 15 billion, about half of it was sitting on dresser tops. There were 7 billion sitting on dresser tops. I'm like, that's a lot of stagnant money. But then I then took a macroeconomics class, and I realized the 8 billion that actually circulated every day turned over 20 times a year and created a $150 billion market. So I thought, early stage entrepreneur, $150 billion market, consumer product, maybe it's worth taking a look at this. So I'm not going to tell the whole Coinstar story today. There are roughly 50,000 units throughout the US, Canada, and the UK. I got to update these numbers. I think Coinstar's processed probably 3 trillion coins, over $100 billion so far. It's fun to tell that story, but what I really want to talk with you about is about Coinstar's impact on the government and the public sector, and Coinstar's impact in the social sector, which was big. So we have saved the US government billions, and we've raised hundreds of millions of dollars for the nonprofit sector. So the two stories I tell around Coinstar with this is we were a young, growing company, and we had our biggest rollout ever in 1995. It was very exciting, and it was in Los Angeles with Ralph's and Vons supermarkets. By the way, I think Ralph's is a terrible name for a supermarket, but that's a different connotation. So we put out a couple hundred machines. We flew back to Seattle. We were exhausted, and my phone rang, and phones used to look like this, so I don't do this, I do that. And it was the Fed in Washington, D.C., and they called up and they said, who are you? What are you doing? The West Coast has canceled all future penny orders. Please come to Washington, D.C. and explain yourself immediately. And we're like, okay, this is cool, the Fed's calling, but we're also scared, right, because the Fed called us, right? So we flew back, and it was amazing. They were really intrigued. Once they understood what they're doing, they're like, wait a second, we have these 2 manufacturing plants, one in Denver, one in Philadelphia. We pump out all these little metal discs. We have to ship them to every zip code in the country. And it's a crappy product. Half of it goes missing. It just sits out of circulation. What you're doing is creating a local recycling phenomena, right, in every one of those zip codes. So people are bringing that those stagnant coins back to the supermarket, dumping it in the machine, And all of a sudden, they don't need to ship anymore. So there's this huge change in the velocity. So that was really cool. They're like, this is super interesting. You guys are going to save us a ton of money on manufacturing and distribution costs. But then they paused and they said, wait a second. We're the Fed. You're not a bank. We can't regulate you. You're not a supplier. You're not a vendor. We don't have a contract. And you're going to save us all this money. Like, what do we do with you? And we're like, you don't have to do anything. You already created the market, right? We built the strategy so that we win as Coinstar, you win as the Fed. And they loved that, right? So there was a win-win collaboration that we had with them. They didn't have to do anything. We didn't have to do anything. But they continued to help us, right? They thought this was so exciting. So I went back to Seattle. About 6 months later, I got a call from the Royal Mint in the UK that said, hey, we were just talking to the Fed. We're here, you're saving the US government all this money. Would you come do the same thing in the UK? I'm like, that's a good phone call to get. So flew over, met with them, walked through it for a couple of days. And they're like, well, how long will it take you to set up the UK? And I'm like, we've never done anything international. And I'm like, well, if we're going to set up the UK, we need to meet with all the supermarkets, the banks, the armored carriers. And they're like, right, we'll set up the meetings, And I'm like, they're like, how long are you going to be staying in town? I'm like, well, I'll stay through Friday. They set up all the meetings that week, and we rolled out 1,000 machines in 6 months in the UK. It was our fastest rollout ever. And what I like to say is that my private sector shareholders got the benefit of that net present value of deployment because we had a public sector benefit that worked together. The shareholders would not have gotten that win if we weren't doing something good for government too. So that's the government story, the public sector story on Coinstar. The social sector story I think is equally interesting. As a kid, I would go on Halloween. I'd go off and collect candy, and my older sisters would go off to these little orange boxes from UNICEF, Trick or Treat for UNICEF, and they collect money. Anybody ever do this? Okay, it's kind of an older program, but it was real. So UNICEF called me up the following year, in '96, and they said, hey, we've got this really old, cool program called Trick or Treat for UNICEF. Kids go off at Halloween, they collect coins. We really like it. It's been around forever, but we have two problems. Half the kids collect the money and never send it back to us. And they're not bad kids. They just collect the money and they forget. I'm like, okay. I said, what's the other problem? And they said, well, the other half the kids actually send us the money, and we have to open up 100,000 of these little cardboard boxes, count the coins by hand, all this type of stuff. I said, no worries, we've got you covered. We're actually mission built for you. So they said, all you have to do is put a message on the back of that little Trick or Treat for UNICEF box that says, hey, take this box down to the local Coinstar machine. We'll cut our fee from 8% to 4%, punch in a 4-digit code, we'll count the coins, and we'll wire transfer the funds directly into your bank account. So UNICEF got all the money with none of the labor at a 4% fee, which was hugely beneficial to them, right? And we got advertising and awareness and trial, which is what we really needed. So it was a win-win type thing. And Coinstar ended up partnering with a bunch of other nonprofit organizations again. But again, it was good for UNICEF and it was good for Coinstar, right? There was a collaborative piece that was out there. So that's the Coinstar story. The second case study I want to share with you is a company called Propel and the Providers app. And same question, has anybody ever heard of Propel? Kathy and David, you can't raise your hands. Or the Providers app. We got one in the back, couple, 2, 3, 4, great, okay. In 5 years, I think everyone's going to know about this app. So Propel's an early stage company, and they're really focused on low-income Americans who are food insecure. And I was speaking at Stanford several years ago, now like 7 years ago, about Coinstar, and someone said, hey, there's a couple of students who graduated, and they're really working on this cool software platform, and it's something about food stamps, and would you talk with them? And when I met with Jimmy and Jeff, they laid out this problem. They said that 1 in 7 people in America is food insecure. That's around 42 million people. The way we deal with food insecurity primarily in the US is the Department of Agriculture has something called the SNAP program. They ship out Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. They ship $115 billion to the states. The states are in charge of administering and distributing that money. So they then hire a credit card company who creates a debit card. And if you apply for the SNAP program in your state, you get a debit card. And when you're hungry or you need food, you go to the supermarket, and when you check out, it says, credit or debit. You'll see an option that says EBT, that stands for Electronic Benefits Transfers. That's food stamps. And the average person, what Propel figured out on food stamps, gets around $200 a month, which lasts about 2 weeks, less though these days. And at the end of the second week, the person on food stamps is getting nervous because they don't know how much money is left on the card. And they don't want to go to the checkout stand and swipe it and have the cashier say, oh, you're out of money. So they want to avoid that piece. So the way the system worked prior to Propel was you could call an 800 number, punch in your code, and it would tell you the balance. Pretty cumbersome. And Jimmy and Jeff were like, I think we got a better way. Let's build an app to check the balances, which is what they did, right? So they're showing me this cool balance checking app, and I'm like, how'd you get that data? And they're like, it's super easy, actually. We just log into the credit card company's back door with the consumer's permission, and we get the balance, and we put it on the phone. So modern technology, on an iPhone or an Android phone, it's super handy. But then I asked them, well, show me what else you can do. And they're like, oh, we can do a lot of stuff. One of the things we do is we help her with budgeting. So we can show her she spends so much money at, what are the local supermarkets in Muncie?
Payless and Myers.
Thank you. Payless and?
Myers.
Okay, so I used to know every supermarket in the country, but I'm a little rusty. So how much she would spend at Payless and how much at Myers, right? And I'm like, wait a second, that's actually not balance data, that's transaction data. And they're like, oh yeah, we download the file that gives us the balance, we get the last 12 months of spending history. So I'm like, time out, guys. Are you telling me you have market share data on up to $115 billion of spending power in the US supermarket industry? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, there are some other ways we can use this data that's out there that's already in play. So what Propel did is they said, we're going to use that data and try to get extra value, spending power for people in the supermarket. And the way they did it is they could walk into Kroger, let's say in Cincinnati, and say, hey, Kroger, would you be willing to give $5 off to the SNAP user if they normally shop at Walmart and they come shift to shop to Kroger, so a competitive trigger. Very powerful, right? And they also went to the manufacturers, all people provide discounts and coupons. And today, the average Propel Providers user is getting about an extra $50 a month of spending power by leveraging the data that's out there. So that 200 goes to 250, so really powerful. But we wanted to push the business model further, right? This was just a kind of a cool thing we could do out the gate. But we said, let's use TSI. So are there other government resources that might be important and useful to that SNAP user? So it turns out most cities, including Muncie, have a program that if you're on SNAP and you shop at a farmer's market, the value of your food benefits will be doubled. So you can go buy fresh vegetables for twice the piece. So show up with $20, you can buy $40 worth of vegetables. Turns out it's a national program, federally funded, that's out there. Well, that's pretty handy. So what Propel did is they're like, shoot, this program already exists. Let's just repurpose it. Let's download the geolocation of every farmer's market, put it on the app, and tell the user, hey, go to the farmer's market, and by the way, here's the bus line to get there and the way to do that stuff. So very helpful. Value add for the consumer, right? Great for the farmers market too, because they get more customers, and an existing resource that was being underutilized. And then we thought about social sector. How could the social sector be helpful to this? And the example I use is in Seattle, there's a women's shelter called Mary's Place. And when women come to the shelter, the very first thing Mary's Place does is download this providers app. It's going to help you with food stamp benefits and a bunch of other stuff. So the social sector is actually working as a distribution channel and a customer acquisition channel for Propel. Make sense? So assets from all three sectors. It's been going really well for Jimmy and Jeff. I think they're the biggest change to the social safety net program at the federal level in the last 40 or 50 years. And they've gotten funding from top-tier venture capitalists in the country. This is a for-profit company that is using a tri-sector model to scale. And you can read about them, and they're really becoming a terrific example out there. So let's think about Coinstar and Propel, right? We had our 3 buckets of Legos. There were siloed resources, right? And in both cases, the companies were able to reach into those buckets, pick out the pieces they liked. We're going to talk about aligning self-interest so you can get access to the piece and keep access to the piece and build these tri-sector models. Another way to think about it is in what we call this molecule, right? So you have the business model in the middle, and you have the resources around the outside. So how can you repurpose some of those existing resources and harness self-interest? So this is what it looks like for Coinstar, right? Supermarkets in the private sector, they were super happy to get more foot traffic, right? And people coming in with spending power The Fed was happy to have the currency system, but also got the recycling phenomena and the charitable organizations. So it was a give and a get for these Lego bricks from each three sectors. And this is what Propel looks like. Same thing, supermarkets, Department of Ag, and social sector organizations. Everybody with me so far? Okay. So I'm going to change gears now and talk about the nature of these TSI models. But before I do, I want to kind of frame this. A lot of people say, well, this kind of is just common sense, right? And I think it is common sense. But I have come to believe in my work that tri-sector business models are the gold standard for business models. And if you are not using a tri-sector model, I think you are sub-optimizing your business or your nonprofit or your government. We can get into why that is. The basic point is that it'll help your business model get stronger, right? And other sectors are there to help if you just know how to access them. I think they're quite powerful, and when I talk to classes or professors, a lot of people say, this is this common sense partnering. And I'd like to think it is common sense. It makes sense to me. It's what my mom taught me. It's what my dad taught me. But the challenge is it's not common practice. When we build our models today, we don't take deliberate action to build these sort of models, right? So part of the reason we do this work at New Impacts, we want to make this intentional and deliberate. This is not like a CSR initiative that sort of sits on the side of a company or an outside metric about ESG. It's not an add-on. This is a core and fundamental part of the business, and that's one of the strongest messages I can give you. So this is why to pay attention to these things. So this next section is about the nature of TSI models. And I'm going to go through kind of the three things. If you're interested in building a TSI model today for your company, or when you have a job in the future, if you're doing a startup, if you're joining a Fortune 100, you can bring this skill set to those organizations and help those organizations get to be stronger and more efficient. And the three sections are resources, sectors, and aligned self-interest. So let's talk about resources first. We've already talked about the Legos, but resources, people often think about resources like an accountant thinks about a balance sheet. And it's great to think about the assets. That's this fourth category over here. But I want you to take a much, much broader view of what resources are. They could be services, skills, expertise. They could be connections, networks, people who you know. Data. We think data is an amazing resource, especially for the 21st century. We hunt data in every sector as much as we can because it helps model scale. And lastly, people are a resource. So as you're using your TSI glasses and you're looking at resources, push yourself to think more broadly about what a resource can be. So, when you look at a cityscape like this, it's not often easy to see the resources, but hopefully after this talk and as you do more research, you'll be able to spot all the resources around us every day and the different types that are out there. So from going back to the Propel story, just a couple of examples. That Double Up food program, that was a resource, right? That could help be useful to the farmers market. And the USDA had the resource with the relationship with the credit card companies. These are types of resources that are out there. All right, let's talk about sectors. This one's more straightforward. Most people understand what a for-profit company is, right? People get that. When I talk about the social sector, sometimes that can be confusing. Are those nonprofits? Yes, they're nonprofits. Nonprofits don't like to be defined by what they're not, so we use social sector. But they can also be foundations, unions, trade associations, civic organizations. Often this sector gets overlooked when building TSI models. But I promise you that the social sector has really interesting and compelling resources if you go hunting for them. They're just there in plain sight, but they're often overlooked. And on the government side, it's basically these are public sector that are taxpayer-funded types of resources, right? Public universities are up here, federally funded research institutions, legal bodies of powers. So when you're thinking about the organizations who built all these resources, again, look for kind of a broad mindset and push yourself to think more clearly about what's out there. This is an example of where resources are and which organizations have them. So we already talked about Propel, right? It needed to give more value to customers, so it found this resource for the farmers market, right? From essentially federally funded. Coinstar, right? People would come, dump their coins in the machine. I gave them a little piece of paper that said $62.63, but people wanted money. So the resource that I needed at Coinstar was cash. And thankfully, supermarkets had a bunch of cash at the registers. Otherwise, I would have had to load the machines up like an ATM, right? So that was a resource. So the other examples here, I'll just go through these three. There's a company in New Jersey called Mokify, and they're super focused on providing credit into BIPOC communities and urban settings where banks have withdrawn, right? So these are people who don't have access to banking on payroll, and they're basically on payday lending. And what these guys realized was really interesting. A lot of these inner urban communities for housing use something called the Section 8 housing voucher, which is a $45 billion federal program. And Mokify's insight was that if you're on the Section 8 federal housing program and you use your voucher and you're doing it on time, that says as much about your credit as if you actually paid your rent on time. So they're using the timing of the voucher payments in the Section 8 program to boost credit ratings for these BIPOC communities in urban settings. Very powerful, very cool, right? Their challenge was, how do I reach them? How do I find these communities? How do I advertise and promote this really cool service? So we're like, well, who are you trying to reach? And in this case, they said, we're really trying to reach black women in urban settings. So we went through a little TSI exercise and, not a shocker, but they thought about the YWCA. So they thought they made a deal with the YWCA in Chicago, who has huge relationships with these women. And they created a branded card, right, that helped increase credit. And they're like, oh my goodness, the YWCA, there's actually 235 of these around the country. Let's use the social sector organization's resource of trusted relationships as a distribution and customer acquisition tool for Mokify. Those are words you wouldn't normally hear go together. The last two up here, RentLogic. This is a company that was really focused on renters in New York. Yale, who's the guy who put it together, is a data scientist, and what really pissed him off was if you'd go rent an apartment building in New York, the information mismatch was too big. The landlord said it was great, and you showed up and the apartment wasn't as good as you thought. And that just made Yale mad. It's like there's a mismatch of information. So being a data guy, he went to the city of New York, he went through all the different departments, and he grabbed all the databases about all the buildings. So we got the database about are the elevators working? Were there any complaints about the washing machines? He found a database on cockroach infestations, believe it or not. And he put all these databases together, and he created a rating system for every building in New York that could say, hey, this building is really great quality, or this is low quality. Oops, I didn't mean to click that forward. Really or low quality. So he was able to build a really cool business model based on a resource built by the city of New York. So here you have a private sector company getting a city resource. And the last one, a little closer to home, goes the other way. We were doing some work with General Motors, and at one point in time they had the OnStar system, the blue button. Anybody here ever have a GM car with the blue button? So I think they've discontinued it now, haven't they? Yes? No? Anybody know? No one knows. Yes, okay. But so a little bit of a dated story, but makes the point. So we were in the OnStar central control, and these calls are coming in from different people like, hey, I want to make restaurant reservations. But they were also getting calls from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Response company, and we're like, what's going on, not organization, what's going on there? And it was during Hurricane Harvey in Texas. And basically, when a natural disaster happens and the cell network goes down, first responders know to run to the GM car because GM uses the entire car as a antenna, and they create this roving mesh network. So here you have a private sector company that built this backbone roving mesh communications network for federal emergency disaster relief, right? Kind of cool, right? I mean, the federal government didn't pay GM to do that, but it worked out great. So these are the different types of organizations that have resources. So when you're hunting resources, think about the resource from across the sectors. And the last thing in a TSI model is aligning self-interest. And this is really about the arrows, right? And I'm not going to go into this deeply. We have some tools around this. But if you want to get access to a specific data set or a specific distribution system, you need to think about a give and a get. You got to build your business model so access to these resources is valuable and sustained. I remember working with Jimmy and Jeff in the early days. They're like, hey, we're so excited about this balance checking app. When should we go talk to the state? In that case, they're working in Pennsylvania. I'm like, don't go talk to the state entities. You're two dudes in a garage. They're not going to give you the time of day. But build the model thinking about the self-interest of that state agency, so that when they do hear about it, they'll be excited, like the Fed was excited with Coinstar, and they'll accelerate you. And that's exactly what happened. They deployed in Pennsylvania. The state agency that ran the program, we're getting all this calls saying thank you. So they, the state agency calls up Jimmy and Jeff and says, thank you so much, come down, and the rest is history. Jimmy is now on the USDA Innovation Board nationally thinking about these things. So the self-interests are very important, and they're the hardest part of the model, frankly. So those are the three components of the model. This new way of thinking requires new tools. I'm not going to take you through tools deeply, but I want to give you a sense of what's out there. On our website, newimpact.care, you'll find this tool that we call an impact journey, which is a little bit like a customer journey, but it's not because it layers in resources from different sectors, quite powerful, that's out there. We have another tool that we call a resource finding tool. We call it the wiki. You can get access to that. It does have information about who's on your team and who has which stuff. We think this is the core part of TSI, and we're actually in some early stage thinking about trying to use AI at scale to look at databases to make this information more useful, more valuable. The tool I want to highlight for you today, because we're at a business school, is something we call the Tri-Sector Innovation Canvas. Right, so some of you might be familiar with a lean startup canvas or a business model canvas or strategizer. I'm looking at the students. Has anybody heard of a business model canvas? Okay, professors are going to say yes. Okay, early in the year, maybe not being taught. And you're going to be taught a lot of things in entrepreneurship and early stage things about customer research and stuff. What we built this canvas to do is to integrate with that process of thinking about your organization, whether it's a startup or an existing one, and to do it with a TSI lens. You can download this tool for free in PDF form on our website. It's also available on Miro, which I use. It's much more digital. But just to give you an intro, you can put in the stuff you're working on. It's broken into 3 frames. So the first frame is the problem frame, where you get to talk about bottlenecks and issues and challenges. The second frame is the concept frame, which is you put it all together. And the third frame is the tri-sector frame, when we talk about resources, orgs, and self-interest. And each one of the frames is broken into blocks, okay? And each block, if you look at the canvas, like P4, what needs or opportunities have been expressed by the people who are beneficiaries, right? And if you go look at the question bank, there's actually prompted questions. So it's meant to be self-guided. It can be taught in a class, and a lot of classes are teaching it, but you can do this on your own anytime, no matter the size of the organization. So that's an existing tool that's out there today. We have some other ideas we're pretty excited about. We have this idea for knowledge commons and some other stuff. So we like building tools. We're tool builders as addition to mindset researchers. The last 2 sections I want to cover is how we do our work at New Impact. So the reason I come to speak with you today is we think that universities are fundamental for both researching and teaching and distributing new ways of thinking. So we do a lot of work with universities, and I do a lot of talks like this, and I talk to a lot of classes and work with different professors that are out there, and I really love it. We also work with early stage companies, incubators and accelerators. This is Blue Ridge. This is actually where Propel came out of. We're doing a session with them next month for 50 startups in New York, for AI for Good, which we're really excited by. So, and I know there's a couple of incubators and accelerators here in Muncie. We would be content for them to teach in a session to the people who are participating there. We also work with foundations and nonprofits, which is fun. We can tell you more about that. We worked with companies. Even Fortune 100 companies have used this approach, I can tell you about too. And we've worked with government entities. So this approach is very pragmatic, it's very scalable, it's very deliberate. This is not kind of pie in the sky stuff. This is getting really serious about which database goes with which asset here and how to put this stuff so you can actually do something in the world that matters and can radiate, that's out there. And then we do a lot of storytelling, right? So I get to talk on, you can listen to podcasts and other things with me. All right, the last section is I want to kind of put a pause on having you think about tri-sector business models around an organization, right? That's what we've done. How do I make a company stronger or a nonprofit stronger or a government entity stronger? We started testing ourselves to think about TSI at a bigger scale. And when we talk to a lot of folks, I mean, this is sadly the reality world, complex, pressing problems, we all know this. Problems are compounding and are accelerated. I can tell you I feel a personal sense of urgency because it seems like we're running out of time to get stuff sorted out fast enough, and that really frickin' bugs me. We're just making progress too slowly. Our existing approaches and our existing tools They're great in many ways, but they're not getting the job done the way we need to get it done, right? So I'm a fan of capitalism. I think capitalism's done a lot of good stuff, but it needs to do more. The financial requirements are huge. I'm tired of these endless tax and spending debates. Nobody's talking about leveraging what we already have. If you can use a resource over and over and over again, that's like a funding mechanism, and it's quite powerful. And we have the technology to do this, but it's not sufficient to do it on its own. We actually need a systemic approach to thinking different about big problems at scale, whether you want to take climate change or COVID or whatever you want to put in there. So when we talk to people about this, we hear these questions come up over and over again. We've talked to people at the UN and the resident coordinators who can't find resources, people who run innovation studios, someone at the VA, I go into this, the director of national cities. These are all real examples. A healthcare diagnostic startup, CEO of an ocean oil company, which is biodegradable. What they all have in common is they're trying to find resources and who's on their team and how they put stuff together. They all have the same questions that we have in TSI, but they don't have the tools and the approach to actually implement, which is frustrating. So we started testing this. We're like, instead of putting the organization in the middle, could we actually put an impact area in the middle of this? And you guys are familiar with the global goals. But what happens if the world's resources can actually be used to drive change with the global goals that change? We've done 6 projects at New Impact, which are very specific. Tomorrow I'm going to be talking about the first one of these about using a public utility mechanism to address food insecurity, and also potentially housing insecurity, which is really interesting. All of these are written up on the website. They're all deeply detailed. You can read about them. There's 30 hours of material for each one of these things. But the point is you can use TSI to solve a problem in your community or a broader area. You don't just have to put your company in your middle or the nonprofit, which I think makes it really interesting. I love this work. Hopefully you can tell that. I think these models are the best that's out there. They create these more sustainable organizations that I think can create impact and scale much faster than other types of organizations. And we think it's important, if not urgent, to get this approach not only out there, but adopted and adopted at scale, which is where all of you come in. Hopefully this is helpful to you, it's useful to you, you can see relevance in your studies, you can see relevance in your current careers and your future careers. And as a takeaway, I'm going to ask you to think about 3 questions. If you don't remember anything else from the talk, just remember these 3 things. So since it's a business school, I'm going to go with the business question first. If I was talking to you about, hey, what does your company do? I would say, what's your private sector strategy? And you guys are all going to a good business school, so I'm going to get some pretty good answers about what your private sector strategy is. And you will have thought about it, and your professors will have taught you about it. Then, of course, I'm going to ask you, what's your social sector strategy? How are you working with a nonprofit? Not how you're giving money to them, but what core asset does a nonprofit have that can be useful to your core business? And what core asset do you have in your for-profit that's useful to that nonprofit's core business, right? And people can generally think their way through that and kind of see how that can line up. And you can think about some of the Coinstar stories and the Propel stories and how that works. The question that trips up a lot of business people is, what's your government strategy? And a lot of business people go, I don't want to work with government, they're going to slow me down, they're going to tax me, they're going to regulate me. I'm like, okay, just put all that to the side. Government has incredibly useful assets, right? What asset can you find in government that could be useful to you? I mean, I found a $150 billion market in my pocket full of pennies, right? Propel found a $115 billion ready-made spending program with a database of customers, right, and a database of balances and transaction information that they could build a business on. Incredibly powerful. So think about public sector assets that are useful to your business, and likewise, what do you have as a company that's useful to government? Now, if you're a nonprofit, you can ask yourself the same questions. What's your private sector strategy? It's not just about funding. And if you're a government agency, can you imagine going to a business and saying, how can we help you that's not about taxation or regularization? So these are the big 3 questions I'd ask you to think about. To sum up, I think that societal progress is moving too slowly. We're innovating in silos. We're too much in the buckets. We're not looking at a whole of society approach. There is simply not enough new money on the table to do all the things we want to do, but we are ignoring this vast balance sheet of resources that are out there. And I think as citizens, and I mean citizens not in an immigration status, but as people who care about a society and a civic society, we need to raise our expectations and ask these sort of questions of the organizations that we work for, or we create, or that we serve the boards on. What is the tri-sector strategy of this organization? That should be ubiquitous in meetings that's out there. I'll close with some ideas that I wonder about since it's a school. I know we have some economists in the group, but I'll just pose this to you for Q&A. I wrote this up, had my daughter check it. But and she and I argue about this a lot, but I'm like, hey, our current approach to capital and democracy has given us exactly what we have today. And in many ways, it's amazing what it's done for over the last centuries. I mean, we've raised billions of people out of poverty and fed and done all this stuff. But it's still not good enough, right? So I think we need a systems update to what we're doing. My question is, if we start to use TSI and if we build our organizations, our companies, our nonprofits, our government agencies, with the resources and self-interest from all sectors, do we inherently create better outcomes? Could you actually create a TSI model that was evil or against societal progress if you really went with it? And I'm not sure that you can. So I think there's something powerful that if every organization moves this way, that it might be the fastest way that we can move towards societal progress. And then Kathy, you mentioned externalities. I kind of wonder if we embed self-interest from all group, is this actually a fundamental economic way to include externalities in a core business model? And I don't have an answer to this, but it's some of the stuff I think about sometimes because I like the work so much and where it goes. All right, last couple slides. I always like quotes. My mom gave me quotes. So, it's great that we have goals, right? But we only get as far as our systems, right? And I think TSI can be a lever and a fulcrum. If we want to see change happen in the world, we need a bunch of change makers, a bunch of innovators, a bunch of impact makers like all of you working these tools to create leverage to have stuff come together on this. Because as I said at the beginning, there are abundant resources in the world, around 500 trillion of them. Let's organize them and create the sort of society that we want to see that's out there. And I think we can do it together. We're here in Muncie, Indiana. What would happen if Ball State adopted a TSI approach, not only in its entrepreneurship program, but throughout its business school? What would happen if Ball State University started thinking about TSI across all of its schools? What if Ball State started thinking about Muncie, Indiana, and the regions that are around us? What if you started to organize your local resources in these buckets and made them more visible and more available? And if you could do it here, I think we could do it in the country and, of course, in the world. And that can drive the sort of progress that we all want to see. We're here to help. We're a little nonprofit. You can find us online at newimpact.care. There's a bunch of stuff out there. If you actually want to use the tools, go to the Getting Started with TSI page, and it'll give you videos and stuff you can download. And you can reach me at these places. But thank you very much. And it's 4 o'clock on the dot. Can I just highlight that?
We're not done. The really important part is question and answer. Cam and can we have the microphones? Where are you? Yeah. So we have microphones so that we can hear you ask your question. And so if you have a question, raise your hand. We've got one over here.
Question here. We got a mic?
We got a mic.
Thank you.
Okay, hi, I'm Nay. And after listening to you, I was really interested so of course, Corn Star deals with the loose change in our pockets. The Propel deals with food insecurity. So my question is, are there any industries that you think are going to have a huge challenge embracing the TSI model?
So the question is, are there any industries that either couldn't, wouldn't, or shouldn't embrace TSI? I can tell you I've been working on this most of my life, much more specifically the last 8 to 9 years. I've only come across one industry that I can't make TSI work on, and in every industry, the model has gotten better. Now you're going to ask, what industry is it? And it's luxury goods. I can't figure out what to do with high-end luxury goods for TSI. I'm open to ideas. I'd love it if it applied, but that's the exception. But in every other case, people might go, can't you just use 2 sectors instead of 3? I'm like, sure you can. But every time I've looked and I've gone through the process and used the tools, it gets better when you include all 3. right? And it's gotta be deliberate and intentional. Thank you. Other questions or thoughts?
Why particularly luxury goods? What about it doesn't work?
Quick answer is, I don't know. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the example that isn't what it is. It's just been hard to find a tri-sector model in my mind. I mean, if you can think why, a high-end Louis Vuitton, piece of luggage that costs 50 times more than another piece of luggage can be turned into a societal good. You can think a lot about their supply chain management, but there's not a lot of resources in the social sector, and there's not a lot of resources in government that are aligned on the luxury goods model. I just haven't come up with it. But the main message is it seems to work everywhere else, which is where the big opportunity is. We got one in the back here.
I was going to say, why do you think it's maybe sort of a new idea of looking at 3 different sectors? Shouldn't businesses have an incentive to look for new resources
Yes,
in new places?
it should be common sense, right? I mean, this is just what my mom and dad taught me. Use what you have, right? But I can tell you that it is the rare organization that does this, right? Who actually goes through the process, thinks about resources and leverages. Our goal is to make it like, let's just do this. Like, what's the issue? When you actually engage in the work, it's a fair bit of work and it's challenging, right? So the surface level is pretty interesting, but as you get into it, you're gonna go, oh, this is much bigger than I thought and much more powerful than I realized. But I share your sentiment. And again, our goal, common practice, common sense and a common practice.
What are the barriers to making it common practice? What is it that stops people from doing it?
I'll tell you right, so the question is what stops people from doing it? It takes effort to actually think through who's on the team and what are their resources. And when we do those 6 projects that we do, they have taken months, right? And you often end up with a jumble of Legos on the table, like you found all these things. You're not quite sure how it all fits together, right? And I can tell you a nice tight Propel story or a Coinstar story at the end when it's very clear, but when you're in the middle of the mess making, it's work. So you need people who are motivated, excited, who want to go further, and it's great if they get the spark and the inspiration, but they got to put in the perspiration to get it done. So this isn't just like, oh, TSI, I get it, I'm going to go make it happen tomorrow. Hopefully there's a couple quick ideas that you can implement, but it's a deep well, and it's a well worth going down, but you're going to work. It's not just laying there. Yeah?
So you were talking about like finding resources that like don't have to do with government taxation and regulation, and I know like if I were owning a company, I wouldn't like obviously that would like scare me if I was stuck in my ways. So how do you sell the idea to somebody that owns a company to switch their like business model to a tri-sector business model?
So a couple things. So first of all, taxation's real, right? Yeah. Policy's real and regulation's real. So I'm not saying just ignore those things, but sometimes the knee-jerk reaction from people I talk with in the private sector, like because those things can sometimes feel oppressive to companies, they don't do the work to find the cool thing that would actually really help them. So the way that I've found to help people see this is to give them examples and give them stories, right? So when I say things at the end like, hey, I found a $115 billion market in my pocket full of pennies, that's generally interesting to someone to find a brand new market that's untapped, right? Or Propel going into a tired old federal program that's been around for years and to realize they have market share data that's been collected but never aggregated or leveraged, and all they had to do was put it together like in a week. That's pretty extraordinary. So tapping into the company's self-interest is the important thing, and really understanding what they're needing. Not because it's the right thing to do or it feels good or it's volunteer, all of which is great. The power of TSI is you actually build it into the core model, so there's no way to take it out. It makes the model systemically stronger and better. Profit and purpose not only should be synergistic in my just opinion, but they can be, and they're powerful. And if you're not seeing that opportunity, you're missing the forest for the trees. So harness the self-interest.
Okay, so can I ask something else now?
Yeah.
What would you do if you're researching, like, government, I guess, like, assets to your company?
Yep.
Because there's so many out there.
Right. So this is a great question. So you were asking a question, what's hard about this? What's hard, you can't go to Google and say, give me all this information, which is why we've been prototyping this sort of research tool. So one thing we can do is email me and we can give you access to the wiki. So that is, it has about 1 million organizations in it. It is not comprehensive, but it can get you thinking about things differently. And also when you do your research, just mentally start looking differently, like, gee, what does my local city have? That could be a good place to start. Just look at the city website. What does the county have? What does the school district have? The districts are really interesting and often overlooked. What does the state have, right? And what are the federal agencies? To make sure you're looking across the different levels of the public sector. A lot of really interesting stuff happens at the county level, and counties often are like, oh, who cares about a county? You know, they just do what they do. No, counties pretty cool. They have the full geographic coverage that's out there. Question over here.
Yeah, so let's say I was trying to start a new business. How do I build relations or relationships with other, like, let's say private or governmental? How do I build those connections, and how do I know if they're like the best connections to connect with?
So the question is, starting out, new company idea, how do I build connections and relationships? And let me answer it 2 ways. One is you're going to be learning that here at Ball State in your entrepreneurship classes, how to reach out, interview people. An amazing opportunity you have as a student is you can call up and say, hi, I'm a student, can I research you? This is like the best thing I think that students do not get, which is when you're a student, people want to help you, right? The moment you graduate, you're in a different lane, right? So take full advantage of your student status to ask for help. That's what I did at Coinstar. I called up alums and I said, I don't know anything about the supermarket industry, right? So I talked to, and there were 2 people. One is Lucky, which is no longer here, and she was younger and lower level. So I said, hey, you know, what are the big challenges in the supermarket industry? And we had lunch for an hour and bought her a cup of coffee, and she told me the top 10 things. And then 2 weeks later, I had a meeting with like a senior person at Safeway who took the meeting because I was a student. And I basically just repeated everything I heard from her to him, like, hey, I understand these are some of the issues in your industry. And then I sort of spin that into sort of a coin thing. So use your student status for building a relationship. But what I want to emphasize on the TSI front is many times you can get access to these resources without having a formal contract and never having met the people, right? All Propel had to do was know about the farmers market database and download it. They never went to the farmers market database company or organization and said, can we use your data? It's a public data source that's out there. The Fed didn't know about me for 5 years. But the trick is I built my model knowing that the Fed was going to be on my team. So when they did hear about me, they accelerated me and brought me all the way to Europe, right? But I thought about the Fed because I knew that they were going to be important. So as you're starting to go through this, think about which relationships you actually need in person and where you can simply just borrow an asset. And we have a whole set of exercises that take you through this sort of front of house, back of house, same self-interest, different self-interest, contracts, non-contracts. We can get into all the, whoever asked the question, isn't it obvious? There's more sophistication to how you build those relationships. Great question. Yeah.
Okay, so you believe that we are not as progressive, but do you believe that something such as AI could possibly hinder other markets it's not intended to?
Well, I don't think I said we're not as progressive. I don't think we're making progress as a society as quickly as we need to be making. That I feel deeply. I deal a lot with the bottom 40, 50% of the country from an economic standpoint. It is not good news, right? The existing programs we have really need updates, right? You can see what we were able to do with the food stamp program. There are another 126 social safety net programs. They all need attention, right? Because it kind of sucks. I mean, we should be using stuff. AI is a much more loaded question. I am not an AI expert. I'm completely fascinated by it. I'm paying a lot of attention. I think if you're not understanding AI and using it, you just should be. It is, I tell my own kids, I was around for the start of the internet. I think this is way, way bigger than the start of the internet. I think it's going to enhance all of your productivity. I think being a young student now, you just get a jump on experience. You get like 10 years of experience out the gate. So I would say learn to use the tools. I've been using ChatGPT just to play with it a little bit. And I'm like, wow, this is pretty interesting. I don't know where it's going. I mean, that's the big question in front of the world right now. But it's interesting. I want to use it for TSI stuff and organizing the world's resources, but I need to get a grant for that, all those sort of things. I need to find people with compute capacity. Everybody's hunting AI resources right now, and they're virtually impossible to find because it's so powerful. Question over here.
First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to give us this insight. But as you were speaking, I kept thinking about the medical industry and the medical research industry and how much waste there is in single-use, even metals and plastics. Absolutely. So has that model been adapted to something like a hospital or something like Lilly, which is in Indy?
Yeah, I don't have any current examples in the healthcare industry. I can tell you in our work, insurance comes up all the time in terms of a piece. So I think there's a lot of leverage around insurance models. Tomorrow when we talk about food insecurity as a model using a public utility and some data stuff that does tie into AI, we could brainstorm in the workshop about how to apply it to housing or how to apply it to healthcare. Because I think that just a little pitch on utilities. I wasn't that into utilities until a couple of years ago. And we did some cool things in this country with utilities in the 30s and 40s, right? We brought water and power in a very equitable way to a lot of people, which created a foundation, right? And I think utilities, there's regulation issues and stuff, and then they get updated, but I think there's a really interesting model for utilities in the 21st century that could be applicable to healthcare.
Thank you.
Let me go here.
I have a similar question, but for the fashion industry. There's so much waste with the fashion
Huge amount of waste in fashion, fast fashion and stuff.
What are your thoughts?
I've seen probably, one of the fun things about my work is I get to go to a lot of different cities, talk to a lot of universities, talk to a lot of companies at a lot of different stages. But this question of fast fashion and fashion waste, it's global, right? It ties all the way back into cotton production in Uzbekistan, right? I mean, it's pretty interesting. I think the fashion industry and that sort of resource is ripe for this sort of stuff. I do remember, I don't know if you remember, it's a business school case, Patagonia's famous ad, "Don't buy this jacket," right? I think that's really interesting. I don't have any keen insights on fashion, but I think it smells like a really good opportunity. And I would encourage you to use a TSI mindset and do some research in fashion. Go have some fun with it if you're motivated by that.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say if any students want to work on anything, I'm from local government, county level.
Cool.
Yeah.
What do you do at the county?
I'm actually the chief probation officer in this county. So
Hey, wait, don't laugh. This whole question of prison recidivation and stuff is massive for labor and workforce and crime levels. It's a hugely important thing.
And the cohort we deal, we have 1,200 individuals under probation supervision in this county at any given time. So they're grossly disproportionately affected by lots of negative outcomes that you've addressed.
And can't get jobs.
We're working on jobs, food insecurity, homelessness, medical health problems. I mean, substance use, mental health. It's all of it. So my question is though, do you have any examples of government kind of utilizing the TSI model? In other words, it seems like a lot of this is through the lens of for-profit business models.
And the talk today, because we're at a business school, I slanted it heavily to for-profit type stuff. But you can, and we have applied it, if you are a nonprofit, right? Here's how you can think about TSI. Let me just give you a general comment. Nonprofits struggle the most with this because they already are kind of TSI. They're already used to chasing resources from every organization out there. And to get a nonprofit to back up and think about self-interest can be challenging. We've done a fair bit of work with cities and counties on this. They tend to be concierge site service, like getting people access to resources and those sorts of things. We did a really interesting mapping exercise for the city of San Jose in California and Santa Clara and San Mateo counties so they could see what's out there, right? So one of the things that was interesting about that is when we built the database, they were really interested in homelessness and they're like, well, what's the issue? Like, they need a shower. So we typed into the database, who has showers? And all of a sudden, 5 people came up with showers. I'm like, well, that was kind of interesting. Didn't hit all the right answers. But I think it'd be really cool, right, if Ball State wanted to work with the county and think about this issue of labor force, right? Food insecurity, housing, and working with accounting, that could be a great project that's out there. I'll also just take this opportunity to say from a design standpoint, what I have learned when you're working on a problem, like, what's your name?
Jeff.
Like that Jeff's working on, which is the tough problem that's out there, there's something called curb cut design as a principle, which is designed for the least fortunate person in society. So the reason we have curb cuts is we designed for people in wheelchairs in the 70s, and we instituted policies. Those curb cuts helped all of us with our rolling luggage and lack of tripping and whatnot. So designing for someone who is just coming out of prison could be very tough, but what you learn from that project might be applicable to many, many more people. So I just think this is really interesting. All right, I'm going to come back over there. Right, I see it waving. Hi.
We were talking about the Earth and running out of time, and
Yes.
I was wondering, do you believe that the TSI model can help improve the state of the environment?
Yes, I definitely, and I say that wholeheartedly. I have, I'm standing here running a nonprofit organization that has not scaled. And you could kind of lambaste me for, why aren't you at the scale you want to be, which we're not at, and there's some issues we can get into. But one of the projects I really want to do is organizing resources around climate and making the Earth the system. So I don't have the slides here, but we could talk afterwards. But if you use things like Project Drawdown, are you familiar with Project Drawdown? So Project Drawdown's a framework about what are the things we could be doing to reduce, restore tree coverage or reduce CO2 emissions and stuff. And we've created a little demo in our wiki saying, well, if you use Project Drawdown on a lens, who cares about these things? Who has resources around tree cover loss and stuff? Similarly, we use a methodology out of Yale called the Yale EPI, Environmental Performance Index, and it uses the Earth as a system. So one of the cool things, a lot of academic institutions create these indices and ways of looking at things, right? And we think we can apply those as data models. I have not done a climate project. I'd love to do one around plastics in the ocean or water resources or farming or any of those sort of things. It'd be a great opportunity. But it needs to get funded to do it, or you can do it as a student. I'm going to come back over here, and I'll come back to you.
So I guess from the three sectors, private sector is the largest, right?
Yeah.
So then I guess
in the U.S. So the U.S. is about 80% private sector by dollars. Nonprofit sector is 2 or 3%, and government's 17, 18. If you just kind of add it up.
So I guess when you're talking about aligning interests, what is the biggest challenge for aligning interests since private sector is the largest?
As I mentioned, aligning self-interest is the hardest part of the model. It's a lot of work to figure out resources, who's got them, but it's doable. The question is how to get access to it. It's a longer answer to the question. I don't want to just punt on that stuff, but you're asking a powerful question that's pretty sophisticated. I guess what I would say, a couple things to think about. Sometimes organizations can have exactly the same self-interest, and that becomes, more clear, right? So, Propel wants to get healthy, nutritious food in people's stomachs, so farmers markets are good, and farmers markets want to do the same thing. So, everybody's really happy for Propel to have the farmers market location with the extra spending power on. They're all kind of united, right? You just have to connect the dots and de-silo. Sometimes self-interest can be completely disparate. So go to the General Motors OnStar example. General Motors built the OnStar button to make restaurant reservations, and that type of stuff. That's how it came out. They didn't build it to be a backbone for FEMA and emergency response. So two very different self-interests. I'll tell you one more thing about the GM story, which might help this. Help me answer this. So when we were there and they were telling us the story about the first responders, we of course said, what else do you do? Be curious is a lesson. And we're like, oh, we're all trained in suicide prevention. And we're like, why are you guys trained in suicide prevention? And they're like, well, Chevy pickups are really popular with returning vets. There's some brand affiliation between a vet and a Chevy pickup. That's just out there. So if you're a vet and you get back and you start to run into trouble, PTSD, other issues, a lot of them don't call 911, they don't call the crisis hotline, they sit in their Chevy pickup and they hit the blue button and they call General Motors, right? So when we talk to General Motors, like, oh, we just do that because it's the right thing to do. But then we talk to the counseling community and they're like, holy crap, 17% of the, cars on the road have, a suicide prevention button on them. What can we do with General Motors? So sometimes you have to get a little bit creative. But in that case, right, the suicide prevention folks aren't thinking about the car company, and the car company is not thinking about their satellite network being useful to this. But the self-interest, they didn't see the same self-interest, but they both saw a self-interest for their own organization. So it doesn't have to be the same, they just have to see it. That's half an answer. More later for you. Great question. Have one of your professors teach it to you. Yeah.
I just had a question concerning with the rise of the elder care need growing with boomer generation becoming the oldest population that you have. How would you use your tri-sector model to look at government data and to try to tackle this upcoming problem that we're facing, because there's going to be more elders that we don't actually have the healthcare to take care of?
It's it's a huge issue, and it is ripe for TSI. I was with some folks at lunch, and we had funding. I mentioned those 6 catalyst projects. One of them up there was around apprenticeships for young people who aren't going to college. That project actually started off as a Social Security Medicare project for aging. And halfway through, the funder said, you know what, we're not that interested in older people, we want to go younger. So they had a strategy review or pivot. So we pivoted that. But I was really interested in the work on aging. There's a lot of data around aging in the country. You turn 65, you get, Medicare and Social Security shows up with that. It's a tough problem. Getting older in this country is just hard, and the healthcare system isn't as great as it could be with it. I think it's absolutely right for TSI. I'll tell you one idea that we had around it. Social Security is the biggest government program that's out there, and it has a whole bunch of issues on it. But one of the things we started to advocate for is why not create a portable account when you're born that follows you everywhere for employment, that can accrue funds tax-free, until retirement, to essentially create up a parallel system to Social Security, because there is just a raw access to money. There's also a bunch of issues around jobs and skilling and ageism and people who can't work, especially people coming out of blue-collar trades where they physically can't do the stuff. But it's a huge challenge, and I would encourage you to lean into it and use TSI and find some solutions. In big, hairy problems like that, we have a tool called an impact journey, which kind of maps out this whole thing, which is important for understanding. But it's also really important because we'll ask ourselves the question of this complex system like aging or healthcare. We'll say, where can you place the lever to make the first change? So often this big mapping will give you insight like, I can't change everything at once, I can't change everything in aging, but maybe I can do this. One step would be to make Social Security and Medicare signups just more integrated. That would be a step in the right direction. Kind of answer your question? Let me come to the professor.
So thank you so much for this. I found it fascinating. What I really like about it is there's a lot of people who will say that markets are evil, they generate all these negative externalities, we need to use government to fix those problems. And then there's people that say government is horrible, it creates all these problems, we need to use markets to fix this. But what you're doing is taking a market-based approach, finding opportunities with the existing resources where they are, and in many ways redeeming both the problems that there are in markets and redeeming the problems that there are in government, and finding ways to synergize them, right, to push everything forward. Fabulous. My concern would be that, right, where reforms would be necessary and most beneficial, if the TSI model takes hold, it could get more interests capitalized into the existing structure such that it's harder to actually make the necessary reforms that would be best in the long run.
Maybe. I think it's worthy of pushing it further. We look at policy, which is kind of where you're going, policy and regulation, as a resource in and of itself. And a lot of people go to policy and regulation as sort of almost like a master layer that sets the conditions for the market. That might be true, and I'd love to talk with you about it offline some more. But let me give you one example maybe on this. So we were doing a project around homelessness in Seattle, and there's 12,000 people who were homeless. Half of them lived in cars, half of them were on the street. And those who were living in cars, it was really interesting because it was like camper vans and stuff. And it turns out they had expired license tabs. They weren't keeping their license tabs for $200 or $300 up to speed. Not surprising with that. And they weren't leaving. They weren't going to get a shower. They weren't going to get support. They weren't going for job interviews. Why? Because the city of Seattle had a towing policy that said if you're in your car with an expired tab, they can't take it, right? But the moment you leave to go try to figure some stuff out, you risk your shelter, all your possessions, all your security. So in that case, a minor policy was actually getting in the way. So I think just in general, I want to get into this more with you, if we can think about policy as a resource and how it plays in the system, if you can align the interests of the policy with the outcome we want, then we should get to a better place. But I don't know that, right? We're still trying to figure this out. We could use some research from university professors to help us and some tests. All right, we'll go here.
Yeah, even outside
Great questions, by the way.
Even outside of like public policy, I was going to make the point that with new money, emerging markets, and these new corporations entering these markets, kind of like Coinstar, do you think that if a lot of companies are using the tri-sector model, that it might increase the likelihood of organizational or market capture? As in, you know, one of the sectors is going to shift from creating value to profit taking, and that's like an unpredicted consequence of working in this tri-sector model.
It's a great question. I hadn't actually been asked that question before. I haven't been asked that one either, by the way. And I want to think about that. My instinct is no on the market capture piece. I mean, sometimes when I'm talking with students, they'll be talking about Propel and they're saying, oh, Propel's evil because you're perpetuating an existing program. Well, I could rather fix the one we have and make it better rather than blow it up. But if you take Propel, let's say the owners of Propel today were completely swapped out by just money-grubbing capitalists who they just cared about making as much money as possible off of poor people. My question is, what would they change in the Propel model? What would they throw out to make even more money than what they're doing? And as I've thought about it, I think the power of the way the Propel model is designed is that they actually make the most money and have the most successful business by having the most good happening at the same time, right? Which I think is a bit of a protective layer if you design TSI appropriately. Now, the questions I had up at the end, like, if you always include self-interest small sectors and resources, do you always get a societal positive outcome? I'd like to think so, but we haven't pushed it far enough to really know. But it's a terrific question.
I have an issue, not a big issue, but with your interpretation of self-interest of entities. When you bring up the question, for example, the Fed,
yeah.
Did it ever occur to you that maybe they would have been, they don't like this because they have a vested interest in producing coins and shipping coins, these are jobs? Because you could have, I mean, there's a level of sort of analysis issue. As a rational actor, you'd say, there's an interest.
Well, let me talk to you about the Mint,
yeah.
Okay? So the Mint is not the Fed. The Mint is actually the production company whose incentive is jobs and pushing coins out there. The Fed's job is different. We built our model around the Fed, not around the Mint. I was invited to the World Conference of Mint Directors. Yes, there is such a thing. It was in South Africa, and I'm there and I'm sitting next to some guy next to me who runs the South African Mint, and I turned, I'm young, 30-some years old, and I turned to introduce myself, and he said, I know who you are, and I don't like what you do. Because of the issues that you're talking about. So I'm not saying that every organization in the world is going to love everything you're doing, but if you need a resource, I didn't need the Mint's resources. I needed the Fed's resources, and I knew the Fed was going to get the huge benefit, right, not the Mint. So they became on the team, and the Mint became fine. But the Mint was doing silly things, like they manufactured, dollar coins, right? And it turns out the ink and paper lobby never were lobbying, they never pulled the bill, right? It makes a lot more sense to have a coin than a bill, but so all the coins just sat in the vault. But guess what? The way the Mint accounts for its accounting system is they're like, oh, well, if we make 4 quarters, it costs us like 6 cents, so we're going to book 94 cents worth of profit to the federal government, which is just nonsense, right? That's just bad policy. That's just bad economics. It's even come forward now, like there's been talk about minting $1 trillion coin to make the debt go away. It's just stupid. So, and those are the sort of things I think that need to get driven out. I'm not saying government's perfect. It doesn't make bad decisions.
Because you run into standard operational procedures. Any of us that have ever worked in government, you got to follow stupid procedures because that's the rule.
Yeah.
And then you have people that are just appointed who can do whatever they want to a large extent.
Yes and no. I've spent a lot of time with OMB and DC around these issues. And so as much as I give you a simplistic introduction to TSI today, a lot of those government resources are hidden behind regulation and policy and the things that you're talking about, right? So it is work to figure out how to get access to it. But I'm trying to give you a sense of the low-hanging fruit. I could tell you another story. You guys want another story on low-hanging fruit? Okay. So I was actually giving a commencement speech at Rutgers, which was kind of fun, 8,000 people. And after the speech, one of the trustees pulled me and says, hey, I work for this biodegradable ship propeller lubricant company. And I'm like, okay, talk to me about ship lubricant. And it turns out every big ship out there has a propeller coming out the back, right, with a propeller that spins around, and the propeller shaft has to leave the ship. And where it does, it needs some lubrication. So it's a positive pressure system. So oil leaks out from the inside and into the ocean. So we're doing something like 6 Exxon Valdez oil spills per day or some insane number with this stuff. These guys had, and if any of you, I don't have my phone handy, I guess I do. If any of you are boaters, there's something called Marine Traffic that tracks all these things. Anybody know the Marine Traffic app? I know I'm in the Midwest, but I love it. It's an app that shows you the data of all the ships in the world and where they are, right? So it's kind of cool. You can see where they're all, anyway, it's a super cool app. It's free. But every one of them is leaving a slug trail behind it. And this trustee was really excited because he's like, oh my God, the company I work for knows about this problem. Our propeller lubricant is like 40% biodegradable. Every ship in the world ought to do this. And he says, and I know the EPA maintains a database of every ship that's registered and the date of the changeout and the brand of the oil that they are using. He says, wow, this is market share data that the EPA has already collected for me. And I know the Coast Guard has an enforcement database around these changeout. All I have to do as, for sales and marketing in this company is put these two databases together, and all of a sudden I can go off and really grow my company. He says, but how do I get access to all this stuff? I'm like, well, let's go look at the EPA website. So we go to the EPA website, we click through 50 screens, we get to the ship oil propeller database, right? We go down to the bottom, and there's a guy who maintains this database with an email contact. So we email him. We say, we're really interested in your database and X, Y, and Z things. And it was open. We had questions. 5 minutes later, he emails back. And he's like, no one ever talks to me, And I think for as many stories there are about in government with all the problems, there are vast resources in government that are just sitting there, that are just easy, that we just don't even know about, right? So there's a flip side to it. So hopefully that's helpful as a response. We're doing a couple more questions and call it good. I don't want to keep people longer than they want to stay, and it's hot in here. Another final question, or are we going to wrap?
I'm going to direct all the questions. We have this lovely reception with food. And so I would want to welcome you to the reception across the way with food, and you can talk one-on-one with Jens. And thank you very much.
Oh, can we do the photo?
What? Oh. And we need a photo. Jens wants a photo with as many of you as we can.